Yeah. Okay, good evening. I'm sorry we're running a bit late today, just sorting out the technical issues. Welcome to the UCL Institute of Education, and welcome to the Center for Education and International Development. My name is Tejendra Ferali. I'm the convener for Education in Conflict and Emergencies seminar series. So we run these seminars throughout the year, and this is probably the third seminar for this year. And the seminar is actually co-hosted by the Network for Education in Conflict and Emergencies, and also the Center for Education and International Development. So within the center, we have a research theme, Education, Conflict and Emergencies. It actually focuses on two interrelated areas of research and teaching. Firstly, we focus on education in humanitarian situations, and we have a number of research projects going on at the moment. And the second strand of our work looks into the role of education in peace building in conflict-affected contexts or protracted crisis contexts. Today's seminar particularly looks into the first strand of our work, education in humanitarian situations. I am extremely delighted to be able to welcome two colleagues, speakers for our seminar today, Dima Kazem and Tomoya Sonoda. And I'll introduce the speakers in a moment. I think we are living in a very difficult moment of our history, given that the massive number of refugees displaced from the Syrian crisis. I think the Lebanon, where I work, hosts around 1.2 million Syrian refugees. And similarly, Jordan, Turkey, and North Africa, and Egypt as well, host a large number of refugees. Access to quality education is one of the major challenges for refugee children, because the host countries have their own education systems, and children who fled from Syria are struggling to catch up with the existing host countries' curriculum, and also the schools in host countries are influxed with massive numbers of children. Language of instruction, curriculum, providing adequate number of teachers to offer decent education is another challenge. But the other challenge for us is, I think, to as practitioners, researchers, development partners, to find out what really works in the education sector, in education in emergencies. What evidence is available? How can we gather evidence in order to inform policies, national and international policies? Access to data in conflict-affected contexts is a major challenge because of security reasons. But also, data manipulation is also another challenge, because in context of contested political spaces where different actors try to sort of report data in order to support different political agendas. And I think some of the work that Tomoya is doing looks into that tension between development agencies, NGOs, UN organizations, and the Ministry of Education in Syria. How information is gathered and how it is utilized to inform policies, and whether or not the problem of what is being reported and what is absent from the whole process of research. But there is also a bigger question about whether the empirical research is actually able to represent the reality on the ground. And I think today's seminar is trying to apply critical realism and its key concepts in order to sort of destabilize this idea of evidence as unquestionable truth, which everybody needs to rely on. So I think the idea is to challenge that from critical realism perspective. So the question is it really possible to know the reality through empirical inquiry, wherever that is possible? So the first paper actually looks at those critical issues. So Dima Kazım, who will speak first, is an MA tutor here within our center and a doctoral scholar. Her PhD is on the health impacts of climate change in the school curriculum with a focus on Egypt. Dima's research interests include critical realist approaches to sustainability, health education, and education in conflict. She is currently working as a consultant in a British Council-funded. Dima has worked as a secondary head of department and teacher in London schools for 16 years. She's also worked as a BBC TV journalist covering the Middle East and as a conflict resolution trainer in Syria, and he's based in Damascus. Respondents argue for support in that area. So Tomoya is also a doctoral student with us, and so he's in the 4th year, doctorate in education, and his research focuses on the politics of evidence in education aid in a conflict environment. So Dima will present first, and then Tomoya will go second. Then we will open for questions and discussions afterwards. Over to you, Dima.
Thank you. Thank you very much for taking the trouble on the first day of snow in London. It was a flurry, but it was there. I would like to talk about the title very briefly. I think I put education and conflict because some of what I'm going to talk about relates to education pre-conflict, in conflict, and post-conflict. Hence, education and conflict rather than in conflict. Okay? And critical realism, you may have heard about it, you may not, so I'm going to try today very briefly, within the time allowed, to explain what it is. And if you have more questions, please ask during the session and also afterwards. I want to start this presentation by a note of hope. Education in conflict is not easy. But I actually grew up in the civil war in Lebanon, and here I am a very long time later. This is the picture taken by my husband of children in Eritrea during the War of Independence, learning under the tree and using pillows to hold their sort of books. So education can happen in difficult circumstances, but it's up to us as critical researchers, practitioners, and even for policymakers to consider what would make it better under these harsh conditions. The roadmap for this presentation is as follows. I'm going to do a quick overview of critical realism as an epistemology and also as a methodology if there is time. Try to apply some of the theoretical concepts to education in conflict, and also to see if we can think about what methodologies can be used, although critical realism is known for its methodological pluralism. Critical realism is the brainchild of Roy Bhaskar, who is a philosopher, or was a philosopher, and he was a UCL IUE World Scholar until his death 3 years ago. I was very lucky to actually study with him for a year, and I think what his main contribution was what I call the defense of ontology, or being, and I'm going to talk about this a bit more. So critical realism, Roy's work, his first work was the realist theory of science in 1975, and basically the work discusses the relationship between knowing, or epistemology, or the possibility of what we know, and being, which is ontology. And he tries to defend ontology as real, so being is real, and is independent of knowing, and we cannot conflate or reduce or eliminate knowing being to knowing. So he warns of what we call the epistemic fallacy, which is when you sort of consider knowing without being. So let me try to sort of explain that a bit more. You can call a child, or an enfant, or kinder, or tuffel, or bichan, for those of you who speak Welsh. But whatever you call a child, that does not reduce from the biological reality of a child. So the way we know what a child is, what we call a child, will not reduce the biological reality of a child. And when we talk about idealism, which is a paradigm which looks at the ideas and discourses, what it tends to do sometimes is reduce reality and reduce reality to what we know about reality. And that's one of the main critiques of critical realism to the epistemology of idealism. Critical realism is based on three principles. I've already said being is real. That is its main claim. And although that agrees to a large extent with positivism, there are differences between both positivism and idealism, and that will come in the discussion. Its second claim is what we call epistemological relativism, as in knowledge is socially, culturally produced, it's bound in space and time, it is not value-free, and therefore, if you think about it, it shares that with hermeneutics and interpretivism, while it shares its ontological sort of stance with positivism. Its third principle is the idea of judgmental rationality, which is that we as human beings can actually agree over our differences. We can come together and, despite our separate different beliefs and positions, can reach some agreement. We'll talk about that later on. Critical realism was developed by Roy Baska over three phases. The first phase is what we call basic critical realism. Then you've got dialectic critical realism, and then the later phase, which is meta-reality. And meta-reality was the phase which was the most controversial, if you like, because Roy Baska was accused of, a bit of a spiritual turn, and not many critical realists themselves actually agreed with him. And critical realists are a bit of a fractious lot, I must admit. So it is a separate paradigm, if you like. It's a separate epistemology and ontology from both positivism and idealism. So the main principle, ontology is real. Ontology is, being is, okay? It is there, it is real. And knowledge is fallible. So our knowledge can be wrong or cannot totally ascribe the true things. It can never be, it can sort of capture the truth in its entirety, but it can capture a truth, okay? So in his first work, he talks about reality and knowledge in three domains: the domain of the real, the domain of the actual, and the domain of the empirical. And he says that the empirical is included within the actual, which is included within the real. And what tends to happen is that people look at data, the empirical, and think this is an exact explanation of reality, when sometimes it isn't. It is only an indicator, as someone in this room taught me a long time ago. Indicators indicate, but they don't necessarily sort of capture the truth entirely. And reality can be found in different ways. We've got the material, the ideal. So the material is things like oceans and trees and people, The ideal, so ideas, are also real because ideas are causal. Socially, so social institutions like the ones I've put here, mechanisms, organizations, structures, agreements, codes, all these are real because they have causal effect. And the artifacts, like this computer, for example, they are real. Actual includes all the events that we see around us, but these events, although they happen in reality, they don't all. And then empirical, which contains the theories, models that we sort of portray and capture knowledge in, and data. Okay? So for Roy Bhaskar, these are the three domains of reality and knowledge, and what is wrong is, okay? They are part of reality, but not all of reality. I am not going to talk about critical realism much more in the sense of, you know, going much, much deeper into basic critical realism. I will move into the phases as I go, and I'm going to try to apply it into education in conflict and see whether you can think that it can be used as a theoretical model, you know, or paradigm to look into education and conflict. So if I were to look at, you know, being is real, what does that mean in education and conflict? Ontological realism means that there is primacy of being. Being comes first. And knowing is dependent on being. We cannot sort of think that we can avoid looking at being when we want to consider knowing. And if I were to look at a Yemeni child, the 7 million Yemeni children who are either suffering from cholera or malnutrition or thirst or all of the above, and who have sometimes little shelter, their schools have been destroyed. If I was to look at the child's well-being, or being even, you know, I can't talk much about learning without considering that. The same applies to the Rohingya refugees who had to wade through floods, and to this picture of Yazidi girls from Iraq who had suffered so much psychologically and physically. So the idea is that as education professionals working in, and practitioners working in education in conflict, we always need to be aware of being. We could put these children in school, but they may not learn. And this is not something that a critical realist would say, or a biologist like me, or a mother like me would say, you know, because my instinct always when people talk about children learning or not learning is I want to ask, have they had breakfast, you know? But that's me. It's something the World Bank is saying. In this report this September, the World Bank is saying a lot of children around the world are in schools, but they're not learning. And they are in schools and not fit for learning. And that's because due to malnutrition, disease, noxious environments, stress, their bodies are not able to learn, because what tends to happen that in acute adversity, children's bodies switch all the energy into survival. And very little goes into growth, both mental and physical. And the worst effect is not found in early infancy, interestingly, or in adolescence. It's actually found in early childhood and until late childhood. So this is the time when children are most vulnerable. So it's important to think about being as people working in education in conflict, and to realize that, yes, the aim is to put children in schools, but or to teach them, but what other conditions are there to help them learn? The other thing I want to talk about is that the Lancet Commission and the Lancet Journal has published a series of 4 reports starting from June 2017, and they looked at health in humanitarian crises around the world. And they admitted very clearly that there has been a clear failure around the world in dealing with health, especially for young people and children. And they are calling for aligning health and development aid. And I'm saying that should be also aligned with education. Because, yeah, send the best books, send the best teachers, give them the chance to sit in and learn, but unless they actually are able to learn, fit to learn, they will not learn. So, on the other hand, having said that, education in conflict helps people learn and helps people stay healthy. So education is important for their well-being, because if you are a child in conflict and you are in a tent learning, that means you're not out to be abused, you're not available for someone to get you to do free labor. So there is a protective aspect of learning in conflict, which is good for children's well-being and people's well-being. And the humanitarian aid needs to take that into account as well. So I've looked at being as real, which is the sort of main premise of basic critical realism, and that knowledge is socially produced. I want to sort of go deeper and now deepen the ontology, so look at reality even more deeply. And this is what dialectical critical realism does. It looks at reality and says it's not just real, it is structured, it is open, so we live in an open and complex world, and it is stratified. And I don't know whether you're familiar with the work of Davis, 2009, Education in Conflict, study on the complexity of conflict and how important it is to look at models that use other things than just sort of linear studies of conflict. I think what she's trying to say is, we need to look at conflict as chaos and look at its complexity and think about education in conflict as dealing with that complexity. And I think critical realism does that. And I'm going to show you in a minute 2 models of how you can look at this stratified reality. The other aspect of being is that being is not just about what is present, it is about what is absent. So the concept of absence. So Roy Baskar warns us against what he called ontological monovalence, as you just look at one thing, which is the presence, but you ignore the absence. Let me give you an example. I think one of the most important absences in education in conflict is education itself. Many children are not learning. Not necessarily in an educational setting, they're just not learning, full stop. But also, what tends to happen is that the data generated about children in education in conflict show what is there, but doesn't show what is absent. Tomoya is going to talk about that a bit more, so I don't want to sort of explain too much. But basically, it warns us about sort of just considering what we see and forgetting about what we don't see. Every time you see, something like, this aid agency has provided 1,000 children with, books, I want to ask, what about the 200,000? Where are they? Where are they absent? Why are they absent? Because the aim of critical realism is to provide what we call an explanatory critique. So you are explaining and critiquing what is absent. Okay? The third aspect of being is that being doesn't just exist in space and time and has identity, but it's also relational and contextual. So, the idea of totality means that I am a totality, you are all totalities in yourselves, but we are all part of a subtotality, which is, the students at this institute and so on. But if you want to apply to education in conflict, you would be looking at the children individually, the children together, the children and their teacher, the school they're in, the community they're in, the donors who provide them aid. All these are sort of totalities, and they are linked together in relations, and we need to consider those relations. Some of these relations are power relations, some of them are power for the good, some are not so good, and these kind of relations and the consideration of them will allow us to understand, what is happening, the generative mechanisms of what's happening on the ground. And the fourth idea is about being as praxis, being as, allowing you to do something. And it is because there is absence. Absence is causal. And when there is absence, people tend to react to absence. So the absence of women's right to vote led the suffragettes to start their movement. The absence of freedom for black and other minorities led to the civil rights movement, and so on. So absences are causal. When there is an absence, it does cause things to happen, and sometimes these things happen positively, sometimes negatively, and we will look at a model in a minute. But what it means that as people who research education in conflict, work in policy, or are just sort of practicing, we need to consider the kind of practice that is transformed and transforming. So I would like you to consider whether there are implications of all of the above for education for conflict, not just for during conflict, but for conflict prevention, reconciliation, and peace. So what is absented, say, from the discourses, the books, the curricula, the pedagogy? What is absented from aid on the ground, the way it's distributed? What is missing, and how can it transform, or how can it sort of constrain? Okay? So Roy Bhaskar, in his dialectical critical realism phase, comes up with this model, which he calls the four-planar social being. And basically, it's a model of social activity. And I like this model because you can apply it for education pre-conflict, for social cohesion, during conflict to deal with what is happening, and post-conflict for reconciliation and for peace. And he proposes that as human beings, we do our social transactions on four separate planes. The plane of the self, our discussions with our own self, the plane of dealing with others, the plane of dealing with society, and the plane of dealing with nature. Okay? And on every plane, there can be factors which constrain or factors which enable, factors which reproduce the status quo, or factors which transform and change positively. So my question to you is, when it comes to education and conflict, how can you use this model in designing curricula, in thinking about pedagogy, in the policies, in designing research, in the practice as practitioners in the field? How can you use this model to transform and not reproduce, to enable and not constrain? Because unless you deal with all these four planes, you are missing something. A lot of work that has been done, say, on curricula and pedagogy, for example, in citizenship or education for peace, has focused on our transaction with others. So psychosocial healing, that kind of work. Maybe society as a whole. But less has been done on the self, much, much less on nature. Nature is very neglected, and as a biologist, I rebel against that, but I'm going to give you an example. By nature, I'm not just talking about the trees. I'm talking about all natural resources. And natural resources are a big cause of conflict. We all know this. We don't need to think about it much. But like when people talk to me about the Arab Spring, something in me wants to say, which spring are we talking about? The water spring, the gas spring, the oil spring? What spring are we talking about? And, you know, it's not just hydrocarbons or water, minerals, diamonds, wood, other things, you know, and the destruction of nature comes at a big price to people because it's about livelihood, sometimes it's about identity, and it can cause conflict. And I think it is very neglected in both education for peace, for social cohesion, and an understanding of this would really help. So that was the first sort of model that Roy came up with, which I thought would really work for you know, looking at education and conflict. But I also like this, which is what he says is an even deepening, more deepening of ontology. So not only you are looking at the 4 planes of social activity, you can actually analyze things on what he calls the 7 scalar social being. So let's say you are doing research in education in conflict, or education in conflict, post, pre, whatever. You can analyze what is happening, starting from the psychological level. So let's say, you know, how feelings can sort of promote or thing of shame, anxiety, fear, mistrust, hate are all feelings that people feel during conflict. And you could sit next to another student or be sitting and looking at a teacher, but you mistrust them because they come from another group or, you know, another region, or they represent the enemy. But also there are positive feelings during conflict. I'm not saying everything is negative. I remember during my childhood in Lebanon, in the Civil War, that a lot of self-efficacy and agency happened because we were helping sort of people donate blood and, you know, doing first aid and what have you, and working at university together as students to do all sorts of things, and sort of it's important to think about what happens on a psychological level. I mean, we all know that anxiety, stress can cause post-traumatic stress disorder, can cause depression. And again, you can have children in school and not learning. On the biographical level, you can look at individual narratives. So for example, let's say you are trying to research the effect of moving schools, multiple moves during conflict, or losing one's house on their learning trajectory. And that is a very biographical thing. And just for the sake of it, I wanted to show you a couple of things. These are the only two things I brought with me to the UK 31 years ago, other than my clothes. During the Civil War in Lebanon, I moved schools 5 times. And I was getting so fed up with it as a child that I asked my friends at the last school I was in to write on what we used to call at the time autographs. This has the entry in 1977, so that probably tells you how old I am. But anyway, this is about 40 years old. It is actually 40 years old. So the impact of changing schools can be very traumatic. And children don't always sort of react positively. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. The other thing about losing homes, During the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, we lost one of our houses. We actually lost 3 houses during the war, but one of them was in 1982. And for me, I went into the flat, there was nothing. Everything had gone. But the one thing I felt mostly unhappy about was the loss of my books and not finding anything to read. And along with my books, I lost my albums, and these were my sort of photo albums of my childhood. So that what I did was sort of go around and talk to people in the family whether they had any pictures of me. And I ended up collecting, I counted them actually this morning before I came, I collected 35 photos of my childhood, and then after those 35 photos, I suddenly became 18. So that's all I have of my childhood. So the impact of losing books, the impact of moving homes, the impact of moving schools is very biographical, and I think it is something worth looking into. At a micro level, Roy Bhaskar talks about how people make sense of society. So when you are a child in conflict, how do you make sense of it? How does it sort of change your life? What do? You see people taking drugs, you see people, killing each other, you see your friends die. And how do you make sense of what's happening? So levels 1, 2, 3 are the agency level, to do with the individual, while levels 4, 5, 6, and 7 are the structure levels. And Roy says that there is always this dialectical relationship between agency and structure. And during education in conflict, there's always this sort of relation going on. It's not just one conflating the other. The agent can't always conquer the structure. Sometimes the structure can conquer the agent, but usually there is this dialectical, because people try to survive, and there is this dialectical relationship. So the meso level is the relationship between functional roles. So the relationship, let's say, between students and their teacher during conflict. And that, I think, is very important, or their teachers, or whoever is teaching them, or their parents, if they are teaching them. Macro level, that's how whole regions function. I mean, I look at the Middle East right now, and I'm thinking, so much has been lost, yet maybe there's a chance for doing something differently. And, well, when it comes to education, I'm talking about education. And so, but also the functioning of whole societies. How do whole societies, so the education system, how does it cope with conflict? What do they do? I mean, in Lebanon, Tejendra talked about the 1.2 million Syrians in Lebanon. Lebanon had to operate a double shift system where you had the Lebanese children attending in the morning, Syrian children attending in the afternoon, because it can't just make up schools when it has, and there's also the 500,000 Palestinians who used to have honorary schools, but these are shrinking. So, when you have a population of refugees, which is about half of the country's own population, how does a whole, society deal with this? Mega level, when you look at whole traditions and whole civilizations. So I was looking this morning at research called The Gap in Empathy, and it looked at empathy and sort of reconciling with the other. And it came up with this idea that collectivist societies, which are not based on very individualistic values, are able to sort of reconcile quicker than those which are sort of based on more individualistic ideas. And it's a very interesting thing that you could look at civilizations and traditions and come up with these kind of discussions. So for education in conflict, if you are looking at education for reconciliation or peace, does that mean that we need to look at universalist values? We need to look at values which sort of bring people together? How does that balance with the idea of the individual? And so on. And planetary. I know this sounds very far-fetched, but why would a planetary analysis sort of impact education in conflict? Well, I'm going to make this claim that climate change which is a planetary, cosmic, global phenomena, will actually increase conflict. And it will increase conflict because of its impact on resources, food, water, because of migration, people movement, and also because there will be probably a rise in prices for energy and others to deal with very hot climates or very cold climates, and because of its impact on health. And so does education have a role in teaching people about this? And so can we avoid conflict by looking at climate change and its impacts and sort of trying to look forward and transform rather than sort of keep the status quo and reproduce? Okay, you've been very, very patient so far. I promise 2 more slides. Okay, we've done basic critical realism. We've done dialectical critical realism. I want to move now to meta-reality. And meta-reality has a lot in it. As I said, it's not the most liked of Roy Bhaska's sort of writing. But I thought there's a couple of aspects in it which are very, very helpful to look at education in conflict and pre and post conflict. The idea of judgmental rationality, that we people can rationally come together and judge things and come from different beliefs, different positions, which can be antagonistic, and agree. And this happens because of 2 capacities: the capacity for empathy and the capacity for reconciliation based on practicality. So basically, what I'm saying is, can education have a role in avoiding conflict by increasing empathy, supporting these kind of values, helping people to reconcile? How can we deal with the idea of the other? Because there's always an other. In a conflict, there is always an other. How can we deal with the idea of the other? How can we tackle these problems? And what Roy is saying is that we need to learn how to identify with others. And I always say to people, you know, you look at the other, and it's always the poor other who's being killed, like the poor other who's being killed on the other side, and the rich others on both sides who are sort of not fighting and not being killed. But that's one way of looking at it. There are other ways of looking at it. And reconciling with others, it's about practicality. It's the fact that people, like what's happening in Lebanon, for example, right now, everyone is talking, oh, is there going to be another war? But the Lebanese, I think, because they've had a very long war of 16 years, have decided no matter what, even if we hate each other, right now we are going to sort of stick together because it is practical to do so. So the practicality being is that you don't want to be, you know, causing more violence. You don't want, you've done the killing, you've realized how pointless it all is, and you come to agree. But this idea of judgmental rationality, for it to work, needs to understand that social bonding needs to recognize individual differences. We cannot bond without recognizing that people are different and that their difference is actually valuable. And so we need to employ values of empathy, reciprocity, solidarity, and tolerance. But also we need to think about so education needs to propose what is totalizing, what will unite people together, what will pull them apart, what kind of teaching, what kind of pedagogy would help people develop these kind of values. This is my last slide, hence the yay. CR, critical realism, when it comes to methodology, is very pluralistic, very sort of democratic, let's say. It totally shies away from positivism and says that we cannot talk about pure causality, that causality is holistic not just pure. It comes from different generative mechanisms, that there are so many factors involved, and it's important to try to explain what these factors are rather than look for atomistic A causes B. It says we can approximate the truth but not determine it entirely, and that we need to consider reality in its three domains. The methods can be single or multi-method, but mostly it calls for mixed methods, because it wants to sort of have that assurance. And it's not just any old mixed methods, like some of the sort of pragmatists call for. It actually looks at theory-laden methodology. So you have to start with a theory, and your ideas are not value-free. Everything has value, and it has to be normative, and it has to be emancipatory. Otherwise, there is no point. And the scheme it proposes is that you actually resolve the individual components of your research. You sort of separate what you are researching. Then you redescribe each component in a theoretical concept. That's what Tomoya has done. He looked at different players, factors, actors, and redescribed them in theoretical terms. Then you retroduce. So instead of induction and deduction, you use retroduction, or abduction, sometimes people call it, which is when you look at your data and say, what is the world, how is the world like? What does it have to be like for the data to look like this? And you try to find the most simple explanation. And then you eliminate other possibilities. You identify the causal, the generative mechanisms, and then you correct. So you call for what is absent to be corrected, if that is your idea. And I think it has a lot to offer in terms of education in conflict. I started with a message of hope, and this is where I want to end. That's also another picture taken by my husband when he was covering sort of wars and famines in Africa, and this is in Somaliland. And one of the things that meta-reality talks about is the importance of creativity. And I think for us to sort of deal with the harshness of education in conflict, we need to sort of use our creativity, and a lot of children do. And this is a child who's writing on the bark of trees because of the absence of other things. So thank you very much for listening. And I hope you felt critical realism has something to offer you.
Thank you so much, Dima. That was really, really interesting. So without wasting any time, we'd like to move to Tomoya Sanoda, but we're going to have to say goodbye to our online viewers and participants. So, Tomoya.